3 days. That is exactly how long the grocery store down the street lasts if diesel trucks stop moving today. Modern cities do not stockpile supplies. They rely on the just-in-time system, which functions precisely like a giant funnel. Food and everyday essentials flow in, you buy them almost immediately, and they disappear. At any given moment, there is a maximum of 3 to 5 days of physical food inventory sitting on those shelves. There is no massive, secret warehouse waiting to restock the aisles when things go wrong. Your local store survives entirely because heavy-duty trucks travel hundreds of miles, day after day. If those deliveries are delayed or stop arriving, the illusion of abundance vanishes, and that countdown clock hits 0. Every calorie you eat is tied to a logistics network, requiring a constant supply of diesel fuel. Without fuel, the food stops moving. We are living one major fuel disruption away from empty shelves. You probably assume the government has a safety net already in place for exactly this scenario. Let's look at how that net is actually holding up. When the supply chain stutters, people assume federal officials will crack open an emergency vault of crude oil to keep the trucks running. That vault exists. It is called the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. To understand the scale of this backup plan, you have to look deep underground. The reserve is stored inside massive salt caverns along the Gulf Coast. At full capacity, these spaces hold 714 million barrels of oil. But those caverns are nowhere near full. In response to energy shocks, the government drained 172 million barrels from the reserve. By early 2026, the American emergency oil cushion sat at its lowest level since 1983. This chart compares the rate of that massive emergency drawdown against the speed they are putting oil back in. The refill rate is roughly 10 times slower than the speed at which they emptied it. Pumping crude oil back into these specific salt formations involves complex physics, making it vastly slower and harder to fill than to empty. The primary emergency buffer designed to protect the domestic food supply has massive holes in it. If another shock hits the logistics system, the margin for error is gone. The popular consensus is that we do not need to worry about oil depletion because electric vehicles are taking over the roads and replacing petroleum. While families are buying EVs for their daily commute, the heavy-duty sectors that sustain modern society run on entirely different math. Around 80% of global trade is moved by the maritime fleet, and 99% of that fleet relies exclusively on massive quantities of heavy petroleum. There is no battery technology in existence capable of powering these transoceanic voyages. This creates a severe economic bottleneck. When oil supply shrinks, logistics networks compete for the remaining fuel until hitting the demand destruction threshold. Once oil reaches between $125 and $150 a barrel, the energy required to physically transport a product across the ocean costs more than the profit margin of the product itself. We have physical proof of what happens when that math breaks down. In 2022, Sri Lanka effectively ran out of the foreign exchange reserves required to import fuel. With zero diesel to power the trucks, food rotted in the fields. People waited in miles-long queues just to secure basic rations, and the cost of a simple meal doubled in a single year. When fuel hits the demand destruction threshold, shipping stops making financial sense. The logistics systems freeze, and food inflation immediately accelerates past the everyday consumer's ability to pay for it. You might assume a wealthy nation like the United States is insulated from these global shortages because record domestic fracking has supposedly secured total energy independence. But not all crude oil is the same. The oil produced in Texas and New Mexico is a specific grade called light sweet crude, which is thin and relatively easy to process. The global shipping industry, however, requires heavy sour crude, a thick, sticky fuel packed with impurities. The multi-billion-dollar coastal refineries in the U.S. were explicitly built decades ago to process imported heavy sour crude from places like the Middle East and Latin America. You cannot simply pour domestic light sweet crude into massive facilities engineered for heavy sour oil and expect them to function. This creates an absurd logistical loop. To keep the domestic system running, the United States is forced to export millions of barrels of its own light oil every day, while simultaneously importing millions of barrels of heavy oil from international partners. The record production numbers are masking a rigid physical dependency. American logistics remain firmly chained to the volatility of global oil markets. If our food networks run on paper-thin margins and our domestic fuel infrastructure is a total mismatch, why are the major oil companies so quiet about it? Follow the money. Major firms like Shell and BP are currently redirecting capital away from expanding their drilling capacity. Instead, they are pouring billions into next-generation infrastructure, like carbon capture and alternative energy projects. They see the demand destruction wall approaching. Their goal isn't to artificially extend the age of petroleum at any cost. It is to let the current system hit that breaking point, while they use their massive profits to buy up the infrastructure for whatever energy system replaces it. The top energy corporations are actively locking in their next monopoly. But while they plan their exit strategy, you are still relying on a fragile 72-hour grocery network that goes entirely dark the second those diesel trucks stop moving.